Hi team, Ms. Vaughn here to read you the last 12-ish pages of chapter 19 of Beloved. As a reminder, this is the longest chapter in the whole book. The perspective shifts back and forth from the outsider perspective of Stampede and the insider's perspective of Sethe. Also as a reminder, remember how memories function in this book is very similar to how like you get to know someone. So like things have been hinted at throughout the whole book, but some of the details haven't gone into, or some of the memories that have been touched on haven't gone into great depth. And so in this chapter, some of the memories that Sethe has hinted at throughout the book are going to be described in great length. And just a heads up that the language can be kind of graphic, and my explanations are going to really emphasize some of that brutality because it's going to build on that excerpt that we read from the last section where Stampede has that realization that even though enslaved people were constantly dehumanized, it is not a reflection of their actual lack of humanity. It's actually a reflection of the lack of humanity of those who own slaves. So that's going to come to full fruition or full development over the course of the next 12 or so pages through Sethe's memories of being at Sweet Home the last couple of days. So we're going to start on page 222. This is going to be from Sethe's perspective, and we're going to follow Sethe's perspective for a pretty long stretch of time. And if you just flip through the pages, I want you guys to notice how the paragraphs and the dialogue, so like there's some dialogue that happens on page 224, but the paragraphs themselves get really long. And so I want you to think about why the really long paragraphs, and think about how like we are in Sethe's brain. And like when I think about my own thoughts, like when I'm just daydreaming or whatever, like I don't think about how I'm organizing my thoughts like words on a page. I get like really lost in my thoughts. And so I want you to think about how this lack of paragraphs on this page functions in that way for us to get really lost within Sethe's thoughts. Okay, page 222 near the top. Sawyer, which is the restaurant owner of the restaurant that Sethe works at. Sawyer shouted at her when she entered the kitchen, but she just turned her back and reached for her apron. There was no entry now, no crack or crevice available. She had taken pains to keep them out, but knew full well that at any moment they could rock her, rip her from her moorings, and send birds twittering back into her hair. Drain her mother's milk they had already done. Divided her back into plant life, that too. Driven her fat bellied into the woods, they had done that. All news of them was rot. They buttered Hallie's face, gave Paul the iron to eat, crisped Sixo, hanged her own mother. She didn't want any more news about white folks, didn't want to know what Ella knew and John and Stampede about the world done up by the way white folks loved it. All news of them should have stopped with the birds in her hair. Okay, so she's like, I'm done with white folks, as she calls them here, because the only thing that they have ever done to her is brutalize her and harm her family and also harm her friends. So like we've hinted at, or she has hinted through her memories of some of the things that have happened to Sixo, and so we get the first hint at it here. Like we know that Hallie smeared the butter on his face after he saw Sethe getting sexually assaulted in the barn, because he was thinking about the milk that was taken from her. And we also know about Paul D and the bit that he had to wear, and how when he was wearing it, he felt less free than a chicken he was looking at. And then it continues and it says that crisp Sixo. So think about like what Sixo would have to go through in order to be crisped. And then we also know that they hanged her own mother. Okay. Once long ago, she was soft, trusting. She trusted Mrs. Garner and her husband too. She knotted earrings into her underskirt to take along, not so much to wear, but to hold. Earrings that made her believe she could discriminate among them, that for every school teacher there would be an Amy, and for every pupil there was a Garner, or Bodwin, or even a sheriff whose touch at her elbow was gentle and who looked away when she nursed. But she had come to believe every one of baby Suggs's last words and buried all recollection of them in luck. Paldy dug it up, gave her back her body, kissed her divided back, stirred her memory, brought her more news of clabber, of iron, of roosters smiling. But when he heard her news, he counted her feet and didn't even say goodbye. Okay, so Sethe is feeling really heavy in this moment because remember, Paulie made that promise to her that she could go as far inside as she wanted to and that he would be there to pull her out or to catch her or to just plain be there for her. And when he heard the worst thing that she had ever done, he went away. So she's kind of like, dang, you made me rustle up all these things about my memory that I wish that I could have kept behind. You told me things that I don't necessarily want to hear. And then you don't even say goodbye when you walk out the door. Okay, so out of Sethe's mind and into the present moment, she's going to talk to her boss. Top of page 223. Don't talk to me, Mr. Sawyer. Don't say nothing to me this morning. What? 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 You talking back to me? I'm telling you, don't say nothing to me. You better get them pies made. Sethe touched the fruit and picked up the paring knife. When pie juice hit the bottom of the oven and hissed, Sethe was well into the potato salad. Sawyer came in and said, not too sweet. You make it too sweet, they don't eat it. Make it the way I always did. Yeah, too sweet. None of the sausages came back. The cook had a way with them, and Sawyer's restaurant never had leftover sausage. If Sethe wanted any, she put them aside soon as they were ready. But there was some passable stew. Problem was, all her pies were sold too. Only rice pudding left and half a pan of gingerbread that didn't come out right. Had she been paying attention instead of daydreaming all morning, she wouldn't be picking around looking for dinner, like a crab. She couldn't read clock time very well, but she knew when the hands were closed in prayer at the top of the face, she was through for the day. She got a metal top jar, filled it with stew, and wrapped the gingerbread in butcher paper. These she dropped in her outer skirt pockets and began washing up. None of it was anything like what the cook and the two waiters walked off with. Mr. Sawyer included midday dinner in the terms of the job, along with $3.40 a week, and she made him understand from the beginning she would take her dinner home. But matches, sometimes a bit of kerosene, a little salt, butter too. These things she took also once in a while and felt ashamed because she could afford to buy them. She just didn't want the embarrassment of waiting out back of Phelps's store with the others till every white man in Ohio was served before the keeper turned to the cluster of faces looking through a hole in his back door. She was ashamed too, because it was stealing and Sixto's argument on the subject amused her, but didn't change the way she felt, just as it didn't change school teacher's mind. Okay, so we're in Sethe's brain, and she's going to go back to one of her memories of 6-0. And this is one of the reasons why I love 6-0. Did you steal that shoat? You stole that shoat. School teacher was quiet but firm. Like he was just going through the motions, not expecting an answer that mattered. 6-0 sat there, not even getting up to plead or deny. He just sat there. The streak of lean in his hand, the gristle clustered in the tin plate like gemstones, rough, unpolished, but loot nevertheless. You stole that shoat, didn't you? No, sir, said 6-0, but he had the decency to keep the eyes on the meat. You telling me you didn't steal it and I'm looking right at you? No, sir, I didn't steal it. School teacher smiled. Did you kill it? Yes, sir, I killed it. Did you butcher it? Yes, sir. Did you cook it? Yes, sir. Well, then, did you eat it? Yes, sir, I sure did. And you telling me that's not stealing? No, sir, it ain't. What is it then? Improving your property, sir. What? 6-0 plant rye to give the high piece a better chance. 6-0 take and feed the soil, give you more crop. 6-0 take and feed 6-0, give you more work. Okay, so 6-0's argument, he stole a pig, he cooked it, he ate it. And so his argument is that it's actually not stolen property for him to cook and eat this pig, but in doing that, 6-0 is quote unquote improving school teachers' property because 6-0 is the property. Clever, but school teacher beat him anyway to show him that definitions belong to the definers, not the defined. After Mr. Garner died with a hole in his ear that Mrs. Garner said it was an exploded eardrum brought on by a stroke, and 6-0 said it was powder, everything they touched was looked on as stealing, not just a rifle of corn or 2-yard eggs. The hen herself didn't even remember everything. School teacher took away the guns from Sweet Home men and deprived of game to round out their diet of bread, beans, hominy, vegetables, and a little extra at slaughter time. They began to pilfer in earnest, and it became not only their right, but their obligation. Sethe understood it then, but now with a paying job and an employer who was kind enough to hire an ex-convict, he despised her for the pride that made pilfering better than standing in line at the window of the general store with all the other people. She didn't want to jostle them or be jostled by them, feel their judgment or their pity, especially now. She touched her forehead with the back of her wrist and blotted the perspiration. The workday had come to a close, and already she was feeling the excitement. Not since that other escape had she felt so alive. Slopping the alley dogs, watching their frenzies, she pressed their lips. Today would be a day she would accept a lift if anybody on a wagon offered it. No one would, and for 16 years, her pride had not let her ask. But today, oh, today, now she wanted speed to skip over the long walk home and be there. So again, the whole idea of how the women are kind of holding themselves up and isolating themselves in 124. Sethe, as soon as she gets off work, she wants to go home as soon as possible. Uh-huh, she said, wondering how she could hurry time along and get to the no time waiting for her. She didn't have worried. Wrapped tight, hunched forward, as she started home, her mind was busy with the things that she could forget. Thank God I don't have to remember or say a thing because you know it. All. You know I never would have left you. Never. It was all I could think of to do. When the train came, I had to be ready. School teacher was teaching us things we couldn't learn. I didn't care nothing about the measuring string. We all laughed about that, except Sixo. He didn't laugh at nothing. But I didn't care. School teacher would wrap that string all over my head, cross my nose around my behind, number my teeth. I thought he was a fool. And the questions he asked was the biggest foolishness of all. Okay, so remember that there was that detail that when Sethe gets sexually assaulted, that school teacher's in the corner and he's taking notes. He very much treats these enslaved people at Sweet Home like a science experiment. It's like the pseudoscience to justify the racism that they practice. And Sethe is processing this. And so when she says, you know, I never would have left you, and that you know it all, remember, she's walking home from work, but it's like beloved is in her brain as she's going through this remembering. Okay. Then me and your brothers come up from the second patch. The first one was close to the house where the quick things grew: beans, onions, sweet peas. The other one was further down for long-lasting things: potatoes, pumpkin, okra, pork salad. Not much was up yet down. Not much was up yet down there. It was early still. Some young salad maybe, but that was all. We pulled weeds and hoed a little to give everything a good start. After that, we hit out for the house. The ground raised up from the second patch, not a hill exactly, but kind of, enough for Bugler and Howard to run up and roll down, run up and roll down. That's the way I used to see them in my dreams, laughing, their short, fat legs running up the hill. Now all I see is their backs walking down the railroad tracks, away from me, always away from me. But that day they was happy, running up and rolling down. It was early still. The growing season had took hold, but not much was up. I remember that peas still had flowers. The grass was long, though, full of white buds and those tall red blossoms people call Diane, and something there was the leastest bit of blue, like a cornflower, but pale, pale, real pale. I maybe should have hurried because I left you back at the house in the basket in the yard, away from where the chickens scratched, but you never know. Anyway, I took my time getting back, but your brothers didn't have patience with me staring at flowers and sky every 2 or 3 steps. They ran on ahead and I let him. Something sweet lives in the air that time of year, and if the breeze is right, it's hard to stay indoors. When I got back, I could hear Howard and Bugler laughing down by the quarters. I put my hoe down and cut across the side yard to get to you. The shade moved, so by the time I got back and the sun was shining right on you, right on your face. But you wasn't woke at all, still asleep. I wanted to pick you up in my arms and I wanted to look at you sleeping too. Didn't know which. You had the sweetest face. Yonder, not far, was the grape arbor Mr. Gardner made. He always full of big plans. He wanted to make his own wine to get drunk off. Never did more than a kettle of jelly from him. I don't think the soil was right for grapes. Your daddy believed it was the rain, not the soil. Sixo said it was the bugs. The grapes so little and tight, sour as vinegar too. But there was a little table in there, so I picked up your basket and carried you over to the grape arbor. Cool in there and shady, I sat you down on the little table and figured if you got a piece of muslin, the bugs and things wouldn't get to you. And if Mrs. Garner didn't need me right there in the kitchen, I could get a chair and you and me could sit out there while I did the vegetables. I headed for the back door to get the clean muslin we kept in the kitchen press. The grass felt good on my feet. I got near the door and I heard voices. School teacher made his pupils sit and learn books for a spell every afternoon. It was nice enough weather. They'd sit on the side porch, all three of them. He'd talk and they'd write, or he would read and they would write down what he saw, what he said. I never told nobody this, not your pap, not nobody. I almost told Mrs. Garner, but she was so weak then and getting weaker. This is the first time I'm telling it, and I'm telling it to you because it might help explain something to you, although I know you don't need me to do it, to tell it, or even think it over it, or even think over it. You don't have to listen either if you don't want to, but I couldn't help listening to what I heard that day. He was talking to his pupils, and I heard him say, "Which one are you doing?" And one of the voice said, "Sethe." That's when I stopped because I heard my name, and then I took a few steps to where I could see what they was doing. School teacher was standing over one of them with one hand behind his back. He looked a forefinger a couple of times and turned a few pages. Slow. I was about to turn around and keep on my way where the muslin was when I heard him say, "No, no, that's not the way. I told you put her human characteristics on the left, the animal ones on the right, and don't forget to line them up." I commenced to walk backward, didn't even look behind me to find out where I was headed. I just kept lifting my feet and pushing back. When I bumped up against a tree, my scalp was prickly. One of the dogs was licking out a pan in the yard. I got to the grape arbor fast enough, but I didn't have the muslin. Flies settled all over your face, rubbing their hands. My head itched like the devil, like somebody was sticking fine needles in my scalp. Okay, if we press pause here and this rememory, okay, so she walks into the barn and she hears school teacher teaching a quote unquote lesson to his nephews. And the lesson is to reinforce the racism that they're practicing. And so he hears them, she hears them like dividing and classifying the qualities that Sethe has that are human versus animal, to justify the dehumanization that they practiced. And when she leaves, she starts to feel like really itchy in her scalp. And if you turn back to page 192, when the hummingbird metaphor that comes in, when Sethe makes the decision to go and kill her children, but she only kills beloved. Page 192, near the middle of that long paragraph, excuse me, it says little hummingbirds stuck their needle beaks right through her headcloth into her hair and beat their wings. And if she thought anything, it was no, 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 simple. She just flew, collected every bit of life she made, all the parts of her that were precious and fine and beautiful, and carried, pushed, dragged them through the veil, out away over there where no one could hurt them. Okay, so when she sees, or she's talking about this memory right now, or she's experiencing this rememory right now of when she overheard school teacher dehumanize her. So then when she sees him coming down the road to 124, it's like her brain goes back to this moment on page 228, goes back to this moment when she overheard them talking about her animal characteristics. And so she's like, I want to prevent my children from having to experience that. And so she flew. And then there's that hummingbird metaphor here. Okay, let's go back to page 228. All right, she's gonna go find Hallie. I never told Hallie or nobody, but that very day I asked Mrs. Garner a part of it. She was low then, not as low as she ended up, but failing. A kind of bag grew under her jaw. It didn't seem to hurt her, but it made her weak. First, she'd be up and spry in the morning, and by the second milking, she couldn't stand up. Next, she took to sleeping late. The day I went up there, she was in bed the whole day, and I thought to carry her some bean soup and ask her then. When I opened the bedroom door, she looked at me from underneath the nightcap. Already, it was hard to catch life in her eyes. Her shoes and stockings were on the floor, so I knew she had tried to get dressed. "I brung you some bean soup," I said. She said, "I don't think I can swallow that." "Try a bit," I told her. "Too thick. I'm sure it's too thick." "Want me to loosen it up with a little water?" "No, take it away. Bring me some cool water, that's all." "Yes, ma'am." "Ma'am, can I ask you something?" "What is it, Sethe?" "What do characteristics mean?" "What?" "A word, characteristics." "Oh." She moved her head on her pillow. "Features. Who taught you that?" "I heard the school teacher say it." "Change the water, Sethe. This is warm." "Yes, ma'am." "Features?" "Water, Sethe. Cool water." I put the pitcher on the tray with the white bean soup and went downstairs. When I got back with fresh water, I held her head while she drank. It took her a while because that lump made it hard to swallow. She laid back and wiped her mouth. The drinking seemed to satisfy her, but she frowned and said, "I don't seem able to wake up, Sethe. All I seem to want is sleep." Then do it, I told her. I'm taking care of things. Then she went on, what about this? What about that? Said she knew Hallie was no trouble, but she wanted to know if school teacher was handling the Pauls all right in 6-0. Yes, ma'am, I said, look like it. Do they do what he tells them? They don't need telling. Good, that's a mercy. I should be back downstairs in a day or two, just need more rest. Doctor is due back. Tomorrow it is? You said features, ma'am? What features? Like a feature of summer is heat. A characteristic is the feature, a thing that's natural to a thing. Can you have more than one? You can have quite a few, you know. Say a baby sucks its thumb, that's one, but it has others too. Keep Billy away from Red Cora. Mr. Garner never let her calve every other year. Sethe, you hear me? Come away from that window and listen. Yes, ma'am. Ask my brother-in-law to come up after supper. Yes, ma'am. If you'd wash your hair, you could get rid of that lice. Ain't no lice in my head, ma'am. Whatever it is, a good scrubbing is what it needs, not scratching. Don't tell me we're out of soap. Okay, so like Sethe is processing the fact that, like, have you ever heard someone say a word and you know that it's not good? Or like, have you ever heard someone say something about you and you don't understand what it is that they're saying, but you know that it's bad? That's what happens to Sethe when she overheard school teacher and his boys. And now that she's starting to figure out what these different words mean, she's like looking out the window and she's scratching her head. And it's almost like she's internalizing this debate that the nephews were having of whether or not she's human or animal. Okay. All right. You was too little to remember the quarters. Your brother slept under the window. Me, you, and your daddy slept by the wall. The night after I heard why school teacher measured me, I had trouble sleeping. When Hallie came in, I asked him what he thought about school teacher. He said there wasn't nothing to think about. Said, he's white, ain't he? I said, but I mean, is he like Mr. Garner? What do you want to know, Sethe? Him and her, I said, they ain't like the whites I seen before, the ones in the big place I was before I came here. How are these different? He asked me. Well, I said, they talk soft for one thing. It don't matter, Sethe. What they say is the same, loud or soft. Mr. Garner let you buy out your mother, I said. Yep, he did. Well, if he had enough, she would have dropped in his cooking stove. Still, he did it, let you work it off. Mm-hmm. Wake up, Hallie. I said, uh-huh. He said he could have said no. He didn't tell you no. No, he didn't tell me no. She worked here for 10 years. If she worked another 10, you think she would have made it out? I paid him for her last year's, and in return, he got you, me, and 3 more coming up. I got 1 more year of work debt. 1 more. School teacher in there told me to quit it. Said the reason for doing it don't hold. I should do the extra, but here at Sweet Home. Is he going to pay you for the extra? Nope. Then how are you going to pay it off? How much is it? $123.70. Don't he want it back? He wants something. What? I don't know, something, but he don't want me off Sweet Home no more. Say it don't pay to have my labor somewhere else while the boys is small. What about the money you owe? He must have another way of getting it. What way? I don't know, Sethe. Then the only question is how? How is he going to get it? No, that's one question. There's one more. What's that? He leaned up and turned over, touching my cheek with his knuckles. The question now is, who's gonna buy you out? Or me? Or her? He pointed over to where you was laying. What? If all my labor is Sweet Home, including the extra, what I got left to sell? He turned over then and went back to sleep and I thought I wouldn't, but I did too for a while. Okay, so like there's so much built into this conversation that happens between Hallie and Sethe. We've talked about this a little bit in class in 6th period about how the Garners think that they're quote unquote good slave owners. But for Hallie, as he's having this conversation and he tells Sethe, it don't matter what they say is the same, loud or soft. It's this idea that the institution itself is the thing that's so damaging. And if you participate in it, you're just as guilty, or like you're equally guilty if you're nice or not nice. And so that's what I think that Hallie's trying to get at when he says that, when he says what they say is the same, loud or soft. That it's all bad if you participate in the institution of slavery as a slave owner. And then there's like built into this conversation, you got to imagine that Sethe's wheels are turning as she's asking Hallie these questions. So Hallie tells her that it's not fair. It's kind of cruel that he's even making Hallie pay off his mom's debt, like buy his mom into freedom. And then I mean, like, take a look at that cost. $123.70 is the worth of a life. Like that's it's pretty hard to digest that this quantifiable number can be applied to the existence of a human. And then for Sethe, when she starts to wonder like how he's gonna get that money if Hallie stops working off the debt. And built into these questions is probably Sethe putting together the fact that if school teacher needs to make some money, there are 3 children that are available for him to sell. So that would drive the impulse for Sethe to want to escape Sweet Home as soon as possible. Okay. Middle of page 232. That's when we should have begun a plan, but we didn't. I don't know what we thought, but getting away was a money thing to us. Buyout. Running was nowhere on our minds. All of us, some, where to? How'd it go? It was Sixo who brought it up finally after Paul F. Mrs. Garner sold him, trying to keep things up. Already she lived 2 years off his price, but it ran out, I guess, so she wrote school teacher to come take over. 4 sweet home men, and she still believes she needed her brother-in-law and 2 boys because people said she shouldn't be alone out there with nothing but people. So he came with a big hat and spectacles and a coach box full of paper. Talking soft and watching hard, he beat Paul A. Not hard and not long, but it was the first time anyone had because Mr. Garner disallowed it. Next time I saw him, he had the company and the prettiest trees you ever saw. Okay, so that's pretty heartbreaking about Paul F gets sold. Paul A gets beat and then lynched. He had company in the prettiest trees you ever saw. Sixo started watching the sky. He was the only one who crept at night, and Hallie said that's how he learned about the train. Okay, because remember, Sixo goes out into the forest in the middle of the night. He likes to dance to get his bloodlines right. And remember that detail about the Hush Harbor when we watched that video clip of Bettina Love talking about it. So when he's out there in his own Hush Harbor, he learns about the train, and the train is not a choo-choo train. The train is the Underground Railroad. That way, Hallie was pointing over the stable. Where he took my ma'am, 606 Freedom is that way. A whole train is going, and if we can get there, don't need to be no buyout. Train? What's that? I asked him. They stopped talking in front of me then, even Hallie, but they whispered among themselves, and Sixo watched the sky. Not the high part, the low part where it touched the trees. You could tell his mind was gone from Sweet Home. The plan was a good one, but when it came time, I was big with Denver. So we changed it a little, just enough to butter Hallie's face, so Paul D tells me, and make Sixo laugh at last. But I got you out, baby, and the boys too. When the signal for the train come, you all was the only ones ready. I couldn't find Hallie or nobody. I didn't know Sixo was burned up and Paul D dressed in a collar you wouldn't believe. Not till later. So I sent you all to the wagon with the woman who waited in the corn. Haha, no notebook for my babies and no measuring string neither. What I had to get through later, I got through because of you. Passed right by those boys hanging in the trees. One had Polly's shirt on, but not his feet or his head. I walked right on by because only me had your milk. And God do what he would, I was going to get it to you. You remember that, don't you? That I did? That when I got here, I had milk enough for all? Okay, so we're gonna dive, that's like real heavy stuff that Sethe reveals about her very last day at Sweet Home and what she witnessed. And so like for us, when we read the part where Sethe was like, I made sure my babies was safe. Like all of this is what she wanted to keep her children safe from. Okay, we're gonna get just a little bit more, and then we're gonna get a final perspective from Stampede. One more curve in the road, and Sethe could see her chimney. It wasn't lonely looking anymore. The ribbon of smoke was from a fire that warmed a body returned to her, just like it never went away, never needed a headstone. And the heart that beat inside it was not for a single moment stopped in her hands. She opened the door, walked in, and locked it right behind her. Okay, so this is going to be from Stampede's perspective. So now the women are completely inside 124. Stampede is an absolute outsider. The day Stampede saw the two backs of the window and then hurried down the steps. He believed the undecipherable language clamoring around the house was the mumbling of the black and angry dead. Very few had died in bed like Baby Suggs, and none that he knew of, including Baby, had lived a livable life. Even the educated colored, the long school people, the doctors, the teachers, the paper writers, and businessmen had a hard row to hoe. In addition to having to use their heads to get ahead, they had the weight of the whole race sitting there. You needed two heads for that. White people believed that whatever the manners, under every dark skin was a jungle. Okay, so here's where the long metaphor begins. That's in your guys' packet. He's starting to think about like, oh, no wonder there's so many voices inside of 124, because there's all of these ancestors, all of these spirits who are trying to get justice for their own deaths that were wrongfully committed. And like we just saw, like we know Beloved is one, but then we just saw what happened to the Pauls too. Okay, whatever white people believed, or sorry, white people believed that whatever the manners under every dark skin was a jungle, swift, unnavigable waters, swinging, screaming baboons, sleeping snakes, red gums ready for their sweet white blood. In a way, he thought they were right. The more colored people spent their strength on trying to convince them how gentle they were, how clever and loving, how human. The more they used themselves up to persuade whites of something people believed could not be questioned, the deeper and more tangled the jungle grew inside. Okay, so there's like this paradox that's happening. It's like white people during this time, these racist white people, they had felt like, oh, Black people are a race that needs to be tamed. They're wild and they're savage. And the more that Black people would try to be nice and unassuming and polite, the more white people would assume that that was their doing. And it made the Black people seem even more wild. Or the other interpretation is that when white people treated Black people so poorly because they saw them as wild, that when Black people reacted in the ways that they did, that it was seen as outrageous and wild. So like if they tried to run away, if they tried to fight back, if they tried to steal, all of these things would then justify the need for the institution of slavery to be able to control these quote unquote wild people. Okay, people believe, sorry, but it wasn't the jungle Blacks brought with them to this place from the other livable place. It was the jungle white folks planted in them, and it grew, it spread. In, through, and afterlife, it spread until it invaded the whites who had made it. Okay, so those videos that we watched of Toni Morrison before we started reading Beloved, where she talked about how if you can only be tall because somebody's on their knees and you have a serious problem, that comes to life in this metaphor here. So she's like, no, Black people themselves are not wild, they're not violent. It's white people who have created that stereotype that have then planted that jungle in Black people. And in order for them to actually plant those notions, plant that jungle, they have to be willing to think those things themselves. So it's not the Black people who need to actually be tamed, it's the white people. Okay. In, through, and afterlife, it spread until it invaded the whites who made it, touched them, everyone, changed and altered them, made them bloody, silly, worse than even they wanted to be. So scared were they of the jungle they had made. The screaming baboon lived their own white skin, the red gums were their own. Meantime, the secret spread of this new kind of white folks' jungle was hidden, silent, except once in a while when you could hear its mumbling in places like 124. Stampede abandoned his efforts to see about Sethe after the pain of knocking and not gaining entrance, and when he did, 124 was left to its own devices. When Sethe locked the door, the women inside were free at last to be what they liked, see whatever they saw, and say whatever was on their minds. Almost. Mixed in with the voices surrounding the house, recognizable but undecipherable to Stampede, were the thoughts of the women of 124. Unspeakable thoughts unspoken. Okay. So we're going to stop there for chapter 19. And again, just to clarify this, when Toni Morrison uses white people and white folks, I mean, she said this in the interview that we watched before we started reading the book, that she's not talking about all white people. She said, like, white people who are investigating their own sense of consciousness, like this is not applicable to them. But white people who, as she says, quote, do this thing, practice this thing called racism. She calls them bereft, like not right in the mind. And so this is a testament to that. In order to treat someone so poorly, so terribly, it has to be a reflection of how terrible one feels inside. And that's what she gets at here with the jungle. Okay. Chapter 19 is done. Chapters 20 through 23, we're going to be reading in class and we're going to be annotating them. They're pretty complicated, but we're going to hear from all of the women's perspective. And I want you, when we read these next 4 chapters together, I want you to be thinking about them not, these chapters not existing like, okay, it's not like first Denver talks and then Sethe talks and then Beloved talks. It's like they're all speaking at one time. And then this is what Stampede hears when he tries to go to the door to knock and apologize. All right. Thanks for watching. See you soon. Bye-bye.